Welcome back to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. We're picking back up for our discussion of Surah 21, Al-Anbiya. Professor Reynolds, a commenter, asked us, do prophets lie in the Bible?
I mean, the question came in response to the first video because they're speaking about Abraham, who, there's this story where he destroys the idols in his father, it seems to be in his father's sort of idol workshop, smashes them all up, except for one, the biggest one. And then, his people come in all angry and his dad, and they're like, what the heck? What are you doing smashing the idols? And he says, well, no, the big one did it. So, I mean, do prophets lie in the Bible? It's kind of a trick question because it leaves two things unanswered, which is what's a prophet and what's a lie. Characters whom Muslims would understand as prophets in the sense of like never doing anything wrong because they're masum, they're infallible. They definitely lie in the Bible. Even the gentleman, thank you for commenting, by the way, who brings up the figure of Jacob in particular. I think of that comment, right?
Yes, Jacob.
And, in the Bible, not in the Quran, he like really wants to get a blessing from his father Isaac. And, the blessing should go to the older brother who's Esau. And so with the help of his mother, Rebecca, he
it's his mother's idea, right?
Yeah.
It's his mother's idea that he should switch places with his older brother.
Yeah. So, mom is like, listen, your brother's hairy arm, so why don't you put on this furry glove kind of thing? Your dad's basically blind. He won't be able to recognize whether it's you or your brother. He'll just feel your arm. He'll feel that it's furry, and he'll be like, oh, it's Esau, and he'll bless you. And like, that's going to stick. The blessing will stick to you. Anyway, we shouldn't speak too much about the Bible because we have to speak about Quran 21. But I mean, the big question is, what's a prophet? But then also, what's a lie? Like Abraham, as we discussed in the first episode, is it a lie to like set up this kind of ruse or trick, which ultimately is leading to a theological point? He leads them in this very witty tricky way to acknowledge that, like, listen, an idol really can't do anything at all.
Right.
Consequently, the heck you're doing worshiping them. So, like, is that a lie?
Well, the prophet is narrated to have said that Ibrahim, peace be upon him, did not lie about anything at all except for 3 times, right? Where he says, I am sick, and he was not sick, when he lied about Sarah and being his sister, and about the idol. So this is narrated by Abu Huraira. It's
so hadith,
Sahih.
Right?
A hadith narrated by Abu Huraira that's graded Sahih. But Arazi, as we discussed last time, commenting on this sort of episode of Abraham and the idols, thinks that Abraham did not lie, but is sort of making a point in through a sort of elevated form of discourse.
Yeah, and it sounds right to me. I mean, it's Arazi, smart, Fakhruddin Arazi, smart guy. So, and that was right at the midpoint of the chapter we're speaking about of the Quran, 114 chapters in the scripture of Islam, the Quran, and we're speaking about chapter 21, known as Al-Anbiya. I don't know, what could we do, like a brief recap? What would you say were kind of the main points we hit upon in the first video?
We just talked about that this is a Meccan surah, somewhere sort of later in the Meccan period, in the first Meccan period, and that it has principally 3 parts. The first part being polemics in response to Muhammad's opponents not accepting his prophethood, and then we go into a narration about the prophets, the biblical prophets, really, and it ends with sort of God's judgment. So.
Yeah, and we got right up to the famous story of Abraham, and this is important to note that the Quran put in its presentation of Abraham puts the emphasis on sort of Abraham as anti-idolater. So it's not enough just to be not an idolater. One must be actively an anti-idolater, and that's right. Represented by Abraham. So, and there's drama here because the biggest idolater of them all in the Quranic telling of the story is his dad. And so, presumably, you mentioned this is by tradition of Meccan Surah. Presumably, there's sort of messaging going on for the Quran's audience, which is like, listen, you need to take a stand against the opponents of Muhammad. Listen to the story about Abraham, who was willing to oppose even his own father for the sake of God and the pure practice of the worship of God.
Right.
So yeah, and then I'm going to share my screen, and we'll start from there, because it's not the end of the Abraham story, right? The next bit is
Arguably just as interesting, if not more.
yeah,
So.
is the furnace story. So as I get this going, could you take us, say one or two things about the furnace story?
Yeah, Abraham in the Furnace is a very, it's a story that's been told over and over again, starting with sort of late Second Temple literature, towards the end of the second millennium
So
BC.
it's not in the Bible, right? It's not in Genesis. You won't find this if you
No,
open your Bible to Genesis.
there might be an opaque reference, I think, in Judges as of Abraham being tested by fire, but we don't know if this is a reference to the Aqidah, that is, the offering of Isaac, or to this tradition. But it's developed in parabiblical literature, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Book of Jubilees, and a number of traditions in Midrash and in the Targums that actually.
Notably, sorry to
Please.
jump in, Hassan, forgive me, but just, I mean, Jubilees and Apocalypse of Abraham, definitely pre-Quranic. The key Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, I think also
Yes.
is before the Quran as well. So we could speak
Right.
about the Quran sort of building on developing a tradition of the furnace story.
Right. And the furnace, I'll just say one last thing. Is the furnace kind of motif comes from the book of Daniel, right? Where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the fire, and they're put there by the king of Babylon, and the fire doesn't harm them, and then eventually this sort of heavenly figure comes in and saves them. So the book of Daniel, that's about probably the second, early second century BC. And then it's developed and then connected to Abraham as well. And Christian authors and Jewish authors in late antiquity, are very familiar with this story. Like we said, it's mentioned in a number of places, including Targums, Pseudo Jonathan, St. Augustine mentions it, St. Jerome mentions it. There's a Targum on Second Chronicles that gives a long list of biblical figures thrown into the fire, chief among them Abraham, for not serving idols. So the connection is that Abraham was tossed into the fire because he did not serve
And
the
one
idols.
imagines that, like, the point of telling this story in a Jewish context is, just keeping in mind the social historical context. Jews are living in a world that is dominated by Gentiles, and under pressure in all sorts of ways. I mean, you mentioned second century BC. I wish I knew the historical context better, but there's the period of the Seleucids and the
Yeah,
pressure to adapt to Hellenistic ways. There's the story of the Maccabees. Like, all this stuff is going on where basically the Gentiles are like, Jews, you got to adapt. Like, stop being so different, stop being so distinct, be flexible. And then stories like this, either the Daniel story, which is set in Babylon, I guess the setting is hundreds of years earlier than the authorship, and similarly the Jubilees, Apocalypse of Abraham, etc. Abraham Furnace story is kind of a way to message to the audience, guys, like, stand firm, don't compromise. We're Jews after all. Our God saved our ancestors from Egypt. He'll save us now. Does that
yeah,
sound like a fair, take?
absolutely. And in the sort of Christian and Jewish tellings, which are very similar, it's actually there in the later tradition. It's Nimrod, the king mentioned later in the Bible,
Yeah.
who
Yes.
tosses Abraham into the fire. And there's also traditions where his brother and his father are consumed by fire. But I think there's something really interesting about the Quranic account, which maybe we can just briefly
Yes.
go over it
Yes.
again. And I want to say that the Quran Quranifies this account, where it's not the king Nimrod, but it's the people, right? The idolatrous people who don't heed the message. So we could say a lot more on that,
Well,
I'm
can
sure.
you explain that point? I mean, here we have, Quran chapter 21, Anbiya, verse 68. Uh, you know, um, just previous to this, very dramatically, Abraham sort of confronts them and proclaims, fie upon you,
Yeah,
and that you serve, that is your false gods, your idols, apart from God, do not understand. And then they all respond in unison. And by the way, interesting point that whenever opponents basically of the prophets or of Muhammad speak in the Quran, they basically all speak in unison. So here they speak in unison: burn him, burn Abraham, help your gods, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, how is this Quranifying the earlier Abraham story?
because you don't have in any of the late antique tellings of this story or earlier the idea that it's the crowds, right? That it's
Mhm.
the idolatrous people who are responsible for throwing Abraham into the fire. It's Nimrod. It's the sort
Mhm.
of authorities. The setting is changed from one where you have a kind of a strong monarchical sort of political structure to one where it's much more decentralized and maybe tribal, you could say, right? I think something closer to what you'd see on the ground in Mecca or other
Yeah,
parts of
yeah.
Arabia, right?
So I mean, can can we know for sure? Probably not, but it seems reasonable to propose that the messaging going on here now in the Quranic context is: listen, there are these opponents,
Right,
plural, out there to our movement, to the Prophet's movement. They're out to get you. God is on our side, after all. And I mean, even here, this is pretty interesting, right? This is a major theme in the Quran. This word kaid, like trickery, trickery, plot, something like that. Here Arbery translates, they desire to outwit him, so he
right.
made them the worst losers. This is always the theme in the Quran, that these guys have a conspiracy out to get you. God has your back. He's your wali, he's your ally, and he will outwit, outtrick, outplot the opponents.
And yeah, and this fits perfectly with, I think, the Quran's representation or presentation of other biblical figures, right? Abraham and this well-known story is cast into the mold of Muhammad's conflicts.
Yeah, completely. And yeah, I mean, and then in verse 71 here, which I'm highlighting, we see that there is a sort of effort to fit in this Quranified version of the Abraham story into something like a biblical chronology,
Right,
because according to the setting in the Jewish and later the Christian sources of the Abraham furnace story, that takes place back in Mesopotamia, where there are these idolaters. The Quran doesn't actually name a place, but that's the Jewish setting. And so all of this is basically in Abraham's childhood, young adulthood, and then later on, Abraham, sort of picking up on Genesis 12, where he's still called Abram. God tells Abram, come on over here to this land
get
that
thee
I've
out of
set
thy
aside
father's
for you.
house and away from thy kindred to the land I will show you. Yeah,
Brilliant. Yeah. So, and then you see this, verse 71, and actually in Genesis 12, he's accompanied by Lot. And so now, Quran 21:71, they all go. And then, I mean, a lot could be said about this, and political commentary could be made. But very interesting that even the blessedness of that land, which, if you follow sort of the biblical subtext, is Palestine, Canaan, eventually the land of Israel, according to the
right,
biblical chronology and narrative. But the Quran does call it, al-ard allati barakna fiha lil alamin.
right.
So, yeah, the land we had blessed for all beings. So there is a concept of something particular about the Holy Land, or I mean, I guess
Yeah,
I sort of said it by calling it the Holy Land. But
absolutely. And I mean, we can't talk about it much here, but there's I think, a great parallel in Surah 5 when the account of the spies that go out and spy out Canaan is mentioned, and very similar language used. The land is blessed. And I think in general, this is a constant theme in the Quran's presentation of geography of land, that, Palestine, Israel is sort of Asham, is blessed land. I'll
Yeah,
also
and
say one
yes,
last thing here is that lil alamin, right? Like here to all the beings,
yes,
Isa Arbery do, but I
yes,
think there's a compelling case that can be made for all peoples, right? Like,
yes.
and maybe there's a connection there. I don't know how explicit this is, but the promise to Abraham, that all nations will be blessed by you or will bless themselves by you.
Which
Um,
comes up, is that in Genesis 22 after the binding of his son
Right,
in the
it comes up a
biblical
number
story?
of times actually in
Okay,
Genesis.
okay.
There's a few times where that's said, but yes, especially most famously right there after the binding of Isaac. May or may not be a connection here, but I think an interesting conceptual thing to keep in mind.
That's terrific. That's really cool, right? Because of course, the Bible itself, I guess, just in the previous chapter, Genesis 21, has God designate for Ishmael as well and his descendants sort of a heritage, not a heritage. What's the right word? He says, "Of you too, I will make a great
A great
nation."
nation, yeah.
So, and then you kind of lose the story, like the Bible just follows the story of Isaac. But okay, and then I mean, just about a lot. So, I mean, the Quran here in Surah 21 is following, I mean, more or less a biblical chronology. Some people say, oh, the Quran is no history. It's just this timeless cycle of infallible prophets. History is meaningless because it's only sending a message about Muhammad. I mean, I kind of think there might be something there because Muhammad really is a central concern. But it
I would
does,
say history is subordinated to that aim.
yeah, to
Not
the
that it's
argument being
non-existent, but it's
made.
subordinated to that.
Yeah. So, and in a sense, I think your point there is vindicated by what we see in verse 74, because in the biblical story, Genesis, Abraham's introduced, basically Genesis 12, and then in Genesis 19, you get the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I mean, in that story, Lot does not look very good, right? I mean,
He looks, I would say the presentation is both worse and better than people think, right?
okay,
Because I mean, he shows great hospitality. He protects them. I mean, under current moral standards, surely yes, offering your two daughters to
yes,
the crowd, and especially if you connect it to the story of the Levite and his concubine later, right, where he actually does that. The Levite does that. He offers his
yes.
concubine to the people, and they brutally, violate and kill her. This is not presented well in scripture, so there's Lot is a kind of a mixed bag, I would say, in the Bible. He's certainly better than the people of Sodom. Something with Abraham's intercession saves him, but in later literature, some of which is actually maybe tangentially touched upon in the Bible, Lot is sort of elevated to being righteous, right? Like if you have to pick a binary 1 or 0, yes or no, Lot good or bad, he makes it by the skin of his teeth into the good category.
Well, okay. I mean, I that's an important rejoinder. Yeah, that's a good point because I mean, the story is so shocking, especially what happens later with his two daughters, that like,
Right, of course.
people forget to kind of begin with the world of the Bible and understanding these characters. But I mean, at the same time, Hassan, like, in my opinion, like the Bible's not actually concerned with, at least the author of Genesis 19, is not concerned with presenting Lot as like a moral exemplar. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely right. You're
and, and,
absolutely right.
and it's really important to remember, especially when you're speaking of Quran and Bible, that it's not that the biblical author tried to make him into a moral exemplar and just failed, like messed up somehow, but like intentionally, the
Right,
biblical author, not only here with other characters as well, is doing something different. Like it's not his intention. That's not what he wants to do with the figure of Lot. I mean, the story of the two daughters is basically what we call an etiology, like it's an origin
yeah,
story for, I think, the Edomites and the Moabites. That's what's going on there. It has nothing to do with saying this is like an okay thing to do in a cave with alcohol.
right,
So,
absolutely.
I mean, that's really important to keep in mind. Now, in the Quran, we see the Quranic author really presents Lot in a, not just barely making it into the okay or good category, but, as all of the other prophets. And Lot, verse 74, to him we gave judgment and knowledge,
Right.
and we delivered him from those who have been doing corruption, who were ungodly, and we admitted him into our mercy. He was one of the righteous. So, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that, but it's just an important point. The Quranic author is up to something different with these biblical characters, and then we're going to see that with Solomon as well here.
I would just completely agree. I really didn't mean to say that, there's a even analogous presentation or intent by the authors. Lot is not presented as any sort of moral exemplar, though to his credit, he was basically drugged by his daughters. But nonetheless, he's only saved really by by the intercession of Abraham, right? His connection to Abraham is what saves him.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and it's another point, but Abraham is sort of rebuked, interestingly enough, in the Quran for seeking to intercede for lots of people. But of course, yeah, in Genesis 19, he's saved by Abraham. Now, turning to Solomon, it's another complicated figure. I mean, in the biblical narrative, he's not great. He's just not great. And, as someone who knows the Quran, whose sort of brain has marinated in the Quran, you're like, what the heck is the Bible doing? Saying, he married these women. I don't know what the total number of wives is, but it's up there with Muhammad bin Laden, the father of Osama bin Laden. Probably much more actually than Muhammad bin Laden. Speaking about Muhammad bin Laden, like, what was he doing? And then he also seems to be involved, because of all these wives, with promoting the worship of false gods in the biblical narrative. And this is told in the books of Kings and Chronicles, or maybe Samuel already. I don't know. I'm getting confused, Hassan, about exactly where the Solomon story starts. But, the point in the Bible is basically to show that, like, after David, things went downhill, and this sort of explains why Israel, at the time the biblical authors are writing, is in such a bad situation. But don't worry, a new David will come, a new anointed one. Anyway, so what about Solomon here? What are your initial thoughts? So we have an introduction in this kind of litany of prophets, Lot, and then Noah, sort of going backwards in time to Noah, and then we go back forwards in time to David and Solomon.
Yeah, so I mean, David and Solomon here and elsewhere in the Quran, are presented as sort of righteous prophets and kings, right? David and Solomon are given judgment. They give some sort of judgment concerning farmland and tillage, not referenced really in the Bible. Would be interesting to see the origin of this tradition. But Solomon is really, I mean, here associated with understanding hukmah, right? Wisdom. And this is, in some sense,
say something about, the association of wisdom with Solomon from the biblical tradition?
It's not specific here, because we see other figures in this litany are also given hukmah, right? But I think the wisdom of Solomon, the Proverbs of Solomon, there are a number of these texts, in both some in the Bible and some outside, that are associated or attributed to Solomon because he's thought of as being wise. The book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and some of the other, Proverbs, other wisdom literature is associated with Solomon. And I think the sort of traditional presentation of Solomon in the Christian and Jewish traditions are like more so in the Christian, less so in the Jewish, but in both, I would say, kind of a schizophrenic figure, right? So he starts great, he's doing awesome, and this is more or less in the Bible too. And then,
but just to jump in, his awesomeness is above all that he's the guy who finally builds the temple of Jerusalem.
But even there, it's like, right before he does it, he's still sacrificing in the high places, right? I forget if it's in Kings or in Second Samuel, but I think it's in Kings, where he's still sacrificing in the high places. Deuteronomy says a king shall not get gold and amass gold and get horses from Egypt. What does Solomon do? He does those exact things. Shouldn't multiply wives. Solomon does that exact thing. So in the Bible itself, Solomon is presented as a great figure with a great fall, right? And ultimately introduces idolatry into Israel.
Yeah, and it's a great moral lesson from the perspective of the biblical authors who are sort of wrestling with, like, if God has our back, if God was strong enough to defeat the mightiest empire in the world, Egypt, why are we now in the situation subjected to? I should know exactly when the authors of the two books of Samuel and two books of Kings wrote, but, let's say in the Hellenistic period, Seleucid period, like what the heck happened? Is this an allusion here, verse 82, 81, 82? This is, so David and Solomon first with judgment and all this, they're kind of together. They both have wisdom. David has this sort of special gift of praising God, and I think we'll return to that and connect it with the birds. But then Solomon, his sort of special gift is that he has sort of power over natural and supernatural things. So he has some power over the wind, but then he also has power, and this is pretty complicated or confusing. He has power not over jinn or angels, but over shayateen, Satans. Is this connected to the temple, his building of the temple?
Yes. So there's a very famous story in, I think, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, and there are other sort of parallel stories throughout Jewish literature of Solomon and Ashmedai, right? And Ashmedai is this sort of a demon, some sort of spiritual, not altogether positive spiritual entity,
Yes.
who Solomon sort of binds with a chain with the name of God and has do like his bidding, right, for the temple.
Connected to the construction of the
Exactly.
temple. And it's just really interesting to see that the Quran, there's some vestiges of this story. And I mean, really, if you only read these two verses, 81 and 82, and I mean, you can kind of see it in the Islamic commentaries, which are reflected, in different sort of modern renditions of those commentaries. You'd just be confused. What is this about demons and diving? But it seems to be a vestige of, the what was understood in later Jewish tradition, the supernatural work that was necessary for the construction of a supernatural building, the temple in Jerusalem. And I mean, maybe the identification of these supernatural beings as shayateen in the Quran reflects some of the ambiguity in the biblical picture around Solomon. I don't know. I mean,
I
the
think
story,
Ashmedai is taken to be a demon in
so
Jewish
it could be
literature.
directly from that. I mean, and then just, this is part of the sort of litany of biblical figures in Quran 21 that really is similar to what we find with the next character, if it's okay if we move
Let's
on
keep going.
to Job. Yeah, so another biblical figure, by the way, all biblical figures: Abraham, Lot, Noah, David, Solomon, Job.
So many biblical motifs, right? Like the birds and the wisdom and just the fern. Like there's biblical stuff. We talked about this a little bit, even with the account of creation, right?
Yes.
In the beginning part of
Yes.
this surah, it's so entrenched with sort of biblical thinking, right? Or the biblical cosmological worldview.
I mean, and so you ask yourself, wait, this is a Meccan surah,
right?
And the early parts of the surah deals with the opponents of the prophets. Everyone assumes these opponents are polytheistic pagans, the Quraysh, who have their idols 360 or whatever in the Kaaba. If really this surah is engaging with pagans, or at least a pagan community, why do we only have biblical figures? And we'll get to Jesus and Mary too eventually here.
Why is the appeal to biblical figures reasonable, right? And some of the appeals are so opaque. We'll get a little bit to this, like to Jonah, or maybe Jonah, probably
already
Jonah,
Solomon
or
in the Shayateen.
Right, exactly.
There's it doesn't explain he used these for the sake of building the temple. Doesn't these things must have been known in Mecca or wherever. Okay, so I mean, Job. We just have two verses of Job. Can you remind us very briefly? I mean, it's an amazing and complicated biblical story. Who's Job in the Bible?
This is just briefly. Job is a sort of he's presented as very archaic old figure, in the land of Uz, who's a righteous man, who's a
Maybe not
worshiper of
even a
God.
Jew, right? Maybe
Yeah,
perhaps not a Jew.
exactly. And he spends his days blessing God, thanking him for everything he has. He's very well off materially, and then Satan comes and he tells God that Job only is so righteous because you've blessed him with all these things. Take him away, and he shall curse you. God allows Satan to take them away, and Job will not curse the Lord. So,
And here in the Quranic version, we clearly have an echo of sort of the later understanding of the merit or the patience of Job. I mean, we still have this expression in English. In the Middle East, people speak of Sabr Ayub, the patience of Job as well. And so you have an echo of this. Yeah, and in verse 83, especially this very beautiful sort of prayer, right? So this is interesting too. Lots of different kind of literary things. We haven't been speaking too much about this, but like this just to have focus on the Arabic for a moment.
right.
Wa ayuba, the grammar there would be interesting. Id nada rabbahu. So at the moment when he called out to his Lord, and then it goes on and say, he's been touched by harm, messani, so like literally,
Right. Touch.
yeah, right, afflicted by, no, literally touched, so
Yeah.
metaphorically afflicted by some sort of harm, dar. And then he says to God, despite, understood, despite this harm, wa anta arhamar rahimin, fits the rhyme. Again, the Quran is concerned with presenting itself as a liturgical or ritual text to be recited. So just like the narrator is ending verses in een, the direct speech of Job, which presumably, by the way, was not in Arabic. You imagine that in the land of Uz, Job was not speaking Arabic.
Unironically, some people do claim some
In the
some
biblical
randos will say it was all Hebrew collapses into Arabic or something like
okay.
that. Yeah,
Well,
but
nevertheless,
no, definitely not Arabic. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, is Job a historical figure at all?
Allahu. Yeah,
Yeah, Allahu Alam. Yeah,
but
but
I will say on Masenni here, like Mary says in the Quran, "Lam yamsasni," right? Like no man has
yes,
touched me.
yes,
So
yes,
same root being used there.
yeah, yeah. So, but here, obviously, it's bad. It's a
Yeah,
bad touching, or rubbing, and so but in the direct speech of Job is made to rhyme with the narration, the rhymed prose narration in the verses before and after. So that's very important to keep in mind, just if you're interested in like what's going on in literary terms of the Quran. The direct speech doesn't have the flavor of like verbatim speech. It has the flavor of it's the same sort of
yeah.
Arabic rhyming as what comes before and after it. Anyway, whatever. Maybe that's not super interesting.
It's like Julius Caesar in Shakespeare in Shakespearean
Yeah,
English, right?
keeping
Like
up the iambic pentameter.
exactly. Yeah.
I don't actually know what that is. I just remember that from high school. So, okay. Yeah, that's meter, right? With Shakespeare, it's not rhyme, it's meter. It has to do with the number of syllables or something.
Yes, but he certainly didn't. The historical Julius Caesar never said the words attributed to him
Yeah,
by Shakespeare.
yeah, in
So
English, yeah, and didn't speak English,
English.
although, yeah. Okay. And since there was no English. Okay, back to Quran 21. So then God answers, says, we removed the affliction that was upon him. Okay, what interests me about the move from verse 83 and 84 with the story of Job is, the Quran, it's a long story. I mean, I think there's about 40 chapters in the biblical book of Job, maybe 42, not sure, around that.
Yeah.
And here we have two verses. So the Quran first has this prayer, this beautiful prayer of Job in Arabic, and then it skips to the end. Because, as folks may know, the biblical book of Job has a prose prologue, which has the story of the devil or Satan, I should say Satan, and God, then a long poetic section in the middle. And then it has a prose epilogue, which possibly comes from a later origin, not really sure. And so the Quran skips to the epilogue, where in the biblical story, God is like, okay, that's enough. I appreciate you for like everything, like your whole kind of vibe. I don't like your friends who came to visit you. They should be rebuked. And, because you've been through all this, I'm going to take away your physical pain, give you back lots of money, and give you back, because he lost all his kids, right? Or aren't they like,
he gets double, right?
they're having like coffee together, and so I'm going to give you new kids.
Yeah.
And this is reflected in the Quran. You don't really see it because in the English, because Arbery says we gave his people. There must be something wrong with the rendering of that translation, because that doesn't make sense. So because it says وَآتَيْنَاهُ أَهْلَهُ وَمِثْلَهُمْ مَعَهُمْ,
right,
which is kind of weird, but what it means is we gave to him, to Job, his ahl. And modern standard Arabic ahl often means parents, but here it means
family.
new children, basically, and more than he originally had. Mithlahum, extra new children, which is actually in the Bible, right?
Yes.
And I mean, maybe kind of weird, whatever. Like, is Job just like, okay, I'll take these version B kids, just as good, and I have more of them, so actually it's better.
I think Dostoevsky's reflection on Job is actually the best I've heard to date. So I would recommend anyone. I can't do it justice here, but I would recommend everyone to look into that.
I mean, anyway, again, as with the Solomon story, you have to know the Job story. This won't make sense. I mean, the biblical version of the Job story, or this Quranic, I think, I don't know. Anyway, okay, fine. Let's not maybe speak about these. I mean, Ismail is of course famous in the Quran, and then you sort of have a problem with the next two figures, Idris and Dhul Kifl. Maybe it's better if we don't speak about them.
One thing I could maybe just say in passing very quickly is the Quran assumes the audience knows them.
Yes,
we don't know them. The commentators don't know them. No one else. It's been lost, but it assumes the audience knows them. But we'll move on with that.
That's an incredibly important point, actually. Yeah, I'm glad you said it. Why is it that the earliest Mufassirun, the earliest commentators on the Quran already are guessing for the latter two characters, are guessing about Idris and Dhul Kifl?
Yeah.
They say for Idris, they say, oh, it's Enoch.
Yeah.
Philologically,
that doesn't make any sense.
Well,
right?
I mean, they know that, though. They would say it's Akhnuch. It's another name for Akhnuch. And then Western scholar, now I'm talking about it. Let's not talk about it.
Okay, we'll move on.
Let's move on to Jonah, who is referred to as the guy of the fish. I mean, there's a nickname here for Jonah, which is intriguing, right? I mean, we had Dhul Kifl, and now we have another nickname. It matters that he's not called Jonah, and Arbery in the English, doesn't render the Arabic nickname, which just means man of the fish or fishman. He just keeps it as Dhul Nun. But anyway, the really intriguing bit is that there's something very close to what happens with the Job account. Again, we have just two verses. Again, we have a prayer by Jonah. The Quran Jonah too is probably not speaking in Arabic,
right?
But we're supposed to have the direct speech of Jonah to God, and another beautiful prayer. Actually, it's very poetic, this section. So nada fi dhulumat, he called out in the darkness, and then the and just introduces a direct speech. It's basically like a opening quotation mark there. An la ilaha illa anta subhanaka anni kuntu minna zalimin. There's no God but you, glory be to you. I have been among the evil ones. So I mean, once again, as with the Job account, I guess, Hassan, there's like just kind of little references or allusions to the narrative detail of the biblical book.
Yeah, where the audience is assumed to know it.
Yeah. So could you remind us just like how does the story go? People are not familiar with the biblical story. I mean, people may only remember that Jonah gets swallowed by a whale or a fish.
Yeah,
But
just briefly, I could say just briefly, Jonah.
especially just to like on one point that you could clarify, why does the Quran have God say, or why does the Quran say that Jonah thought God wouldn't be able to do anything against him? What's going on there?
I think that has to do with Jonah not. Jonah knows that God has commanded him to go preach to the Ninevites that they repent. Jonah doesn't want to do this. He tries to avoid it. He gets on the ship,
Yes,
and then there's the storm, and everyone's asking him, why is this? He's like, oh, it's actually because God is mad at me. Throw me overboard. So he
yes,
had left. He'd kind of gone his own way.
yeah. I mean, the story is like again, it, there is. I think there's a mention somewhere in the Book of Kings or someone to a real historical prophet named Jonah, but the biblical book about Jonah, like kind of uses that name and just tells the story, set in the time when Assyria and Nineveh was still a thing. But like the story, I mean, a little bit like the Job story, is filled with like messaging, allegory,
Right.
symbolism. Being swallowed by a fish. Uh,
I mean, he dies. I would say. I think in the Jonah story in the Bible, certain scholars, commentators have pointed this out as well. That he literally goes down into the pit.
mm,
It's out. He calls out, and he calls out to God. Right? Like there's
yes,
that. That is it's sort of in both accounts in the Quran and the Bible. That he calls out to God from. I mean, in here the darkness in the Quran
yes.
in the darkness, and from in the Bible from the pit, from Sheol.
And then Jesus in the New Testament speaks
Yeah.
about the sign of Jonah,
Right.
alluding to his own death and resurrection. Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. We could speak all all day about Jonah in the Bible, in the Quran. Just maybe a final point, and then we can get on. Maybe we'll skip to verse 95 because I think that's important. We address 95. But I mean, this point should be made about Jonah in the Bible and Jonah in the Quran. They are playing completely different roles. I think you used the verb Quranify.
Right.
In the Jonah story in the Bible, again, written much after the facts which it present, or the story which it tells, the setting of that story. It's a Jewish author working in a later period, maybe the Hellenistic period, and telling a story about hundreds of years earlier, before um, Nineveh was destroyed, I
Right.
think by like a Babylonian Persian alliance or something.
Right.
So let's say 7th century BC, when Assyria was still a thing, and Assyria was like the paradigmatic evil empire, like, Darth Vader kind of vibes. And so the lesson that the Jewish author is trying to tell is like, listen, actually, God loves the Gentiles too. I know you hate them. You have good reason to hate them. They keep on persecuting Israel, but God loves them too. God is the Lord of everyone. He cares about like that. It's a
Right.
Gentile Jewish thing going on. Also theology, blah blah blah. I mean, but the Quran uses this as part of its litany, like advancing these characters all from the Bible and showing their kind of virtues, and
Absolutely.
in different ways, probably using them to point to Muhammad.
And just to close that out, in verse 92, we have inna haza ummatukum, right? And that's interesting because it's said in the second person plural.
Yes,
This is
yes.
said to
This
the
mhm.
audience.
This community of yours in the
Yeah.
plural, kum.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what do you make anything of this? Does this tell us about the audience? Would the Meccan pagans consider themselves in one ummah with the biblical prophets?
I do think there's messaging to the sort of community of believers here, in a way that sets them apart from their opponents. Who would
This would be spoken to Muhammad's community.
Yeah, I think there's a particular appeal to a unity within the community. And in a way, all of these stories sort of redound to that. Like, follow Muhammad or Muhammad's religion, stick to this community, be aware of the opponents. Basically, that's what all of the earlier prophets did. Abraham did this against his opponents. Um, we also like Job. I mean, Lot did, but then even Job and Jonah, in their own way, they were obedient to God, and God sort of, delivered them. And then the Quran sort of leverages the Jonah story to say, listen, just as we saved Jonah, this is, look at the end of this verse. We delivered the believers. We save, literally, is the Arabic verb. We save the believers. So I think there's like, rally the troops kind of vibe going on here.
Sure.
And there is concern of division. Now, the verse you pointed out is really important that you mentioned this, because it follows up on the allusion to Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? In verse 91.
Yes, that's right.
And I guess
She
you
who
could say, well,
guarded
you had to
her
get there.
virginity, or her farj, right? Again, not named.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a continuation of this biblical sort of litany of biblical prophets, all biblical, presumably. I mean, maybe the Kifl we could debate about, but yeah. And then, interesting that Mary is brought up. Now, Mary is oftentimes like linked to the figure of John, Yahya. So that's part of it. But there is like something added, like there's an extra bit here in verse 91, because there is sort of the use or the pointing to Mary's conception of Jesus as a sign.
Yeah. Well, they're both signs, right?
They're both signs. Yeah, good point. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you want to speak about this more, or we should go on to verse 95. But this is intriguing that the Quran has God Himself say. This is anthropomorphic language. Obviously, interpreters often try to avoid the anthropomorphism, but it's God who says, "Nafakhna fiha." We breathe.
It's not Gabriel. It's not Gabriel breathing.
No.
Right. Yeah.
But the later stories that the interpreters tell say, no, it actually was Gabriel, right, who breathed into an opening in Mary's garment. But it actually says nafakhta fiha min ruhina. So we did the breathing. So
I'm really glad you brought that up. That's, I think, an important part of this verse, and also that they're both signs, right? We made her and her son, jalnaha wa abnaha.
And then here's a connection to the Adam story, right? The creation of Adam through God's breath.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Which might set apart Jesus and Adam in a certain way.
I think that's a consistent theme throughout the Quran.
What's that?
That Adam and Jesus are sort of parallel. This is almost one of the Quran's arguments, right? Like we said be and it is, and I think against Jesus's divinity is that we also did this to Adam. Yeah, we made that.
Yeah, presumably responding to Christian arguments for Christ's divinity based on
his lack of father. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to verse 95. I mean, I tend to avoid the temptation to sort of Christianize language in the Quran about Jesus as God's spirit, or Jesus being created by God's spirit. I mean, I just think if you appreciate the whole Quranic text, it's really not coherent to Christianize it. Instead, you have sort of remnants of Christian language, obviously. But there's so much that's left uncertain, including verse 95. So, we're kind of at the end of the biblical chronology. This is going to lead into an apocalyptic allusion in verse 96. So, we've gone from basically like Abraham all the way up to Jesus and Mary, and then forward into the future when, the apocalyptic times will come. But, before then, we have this kind of reflection on what's happened maybe to the Christian community, or maybe between the Jews and the Christians, right?
Right.
And then this verse 95, I mean, how do you understand this word of a haram? A haram, translated here intriguingly, This may seem like a funny translation to many people, a ban. Why is a haram a ban?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. This is one of the very interesting touch points, I think, between the Quran and sort of biblical literature. In Hebrew, cherem is a ban, right? Like, and it's the term that describes the sort of warfare prevalent in the Near East, where there would be a ban on a city or a people, and it would lead to their total slaughter, right? Or certain goods there's a cherem on these, and they're set aside or set apart
So
for
ban, that
God.
English word ban, it must be like an older meaning or sense of this word, right?
Right.
Because
And this is the language that we see used in the book of Joshua, late in Deuteronomy as well. And Nikolai Sinai actually mentions in his key terms that there's a debate as to because as to what this means in the tafsir, the tradition, because it can be read as haram or hiram, right? So there's actually a variant here, and then it's equated with azam or things like that as well. And also, I think Andrew Rippin, all the way back in 1979, wrote an article basically proposing its connection to biblical harem, right? That a ban, which is what I think Jeffrey is also sort of um, informed by, because it seems to say, I mean, if you read it like that, that there's a ban, there's a ban upon every city that we have destroyed, they shall not return. You could say like every city on which there was a ban, indeed, they will not return. They will
and
not
then
return,
I
right?
mean it continues in verse 96, right? Because there's hatta
Yes, yeah,
until.
exactly. Hatta, until when Gog and Magog are unloosed. This is eschatological from the book of Ezekiel, right? This basically means till the end times, right?
So I think maybe we should sort this out here, Gog and Magog, and figure that bit out. And maybe we should uh, conclude part two on that point of our discussion of Quran 21. But it's really important to speak about Gog and Magog because this is a classic example, kind of like Nimrod, which we didn't actually speak about, but. This is a classic example where people like, whether, Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, they've heard of Gog and Magog in kind of Western culture generally. Sorry, I said Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog. They're kind of just symbols of like, I don't know, something apocalyptic. But you just mentioned that they're already in the book of Ezekiel. So it's not just the book of Revelation, the last book of the
Right.
Bible. Yeah.
So this is connected to a prophecy that describes in Ezekiel 38 that describes a battle between Gog and his army and the people of Israel.
So Gog is a person
Yeah, he's a sort of
in the Old
evil.
Testament.
Yeah, he's sort of he represents a sort of like an evil uh I don't know,
Yeah.
entity, empire, etc.
Personification.
Personification
Yeah.
of evil. And
Yeah.
this is like it's an eschatological battle ultimately in how it's received in Jewish tradition. And I think the Quran is picking up on this, right? This takes us into the eschatology portion of the surah.
Absolutely. And, Gog and Magog also appear in the Dhul Qarnayn, a story of Quran 18. I believe that in the book of Revelation, the reference to someone named Gog in the Old Testament now becomes a reference to a people who will sort of swarm the earth. And I'm sure this is developed. I don't actually know. I don't actually know 100%. So I'm mostly sure that this is developed in, late antique Christian apocalyptic reflection, and it makes its way into the Quran. Here, I mean, I think Alexander, doesn't he build a wall that keeps him out, which
Yeah.
may explain why this verb is used, futihat, when it is opened. I mean,
Yes,
it's,
right.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the
And
translation,
Alexander there is a sort of it's eschatological. The Alexander legend,
yeah.
he's a sort of type for Christ. Yeah.
And so, I mean, in a way, this bit here is kind of the conclusion of this biblical litany, which brought us up to the New Testament, now in a way to the book of Revelation. And this is like, I don't know, where the preacher brings the argument home,
Yeah.
tries to seal the deal. Because the Quran then gives the direct speech. Mehdi Azayas, of Louvain-la-Neuve University would call this future counter discourse. Gives the direct speech of what the unbelievers will say in Arabic, and again, all together in chorus. Interesting literary feature on the day of, basically the day of judgment. Alas for us, we were heedless of this. We were evildoers. So they'll confess their own sins. It'll be too late. And then, without really introducing it, now it seems to be God speaking to them. And just a last point here. You may have commentary too, but in verse 98, Hassan. So God speaks to these unbelievers, and says, you guys, innakum,
Right.
and the things which you worship, ma ta'budun, other than God, are fuel. I mean, the Arabic word is usually understood to mean like basically the stuff that will be burned in Jahannam. So anyway, intriguing, because it kind of suggests that it has God sort of speaking directly, which is interesting to the
Right.
unbelievers, and then like those things that they worship are kind of personified, made real, because they're also going to be punished.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's is it the literal materials, right? Because in Surah Baqarah, there's this image of the fire. It's that rocks, right? Literally, it's burning rocks, and
Exactly.
the unbelievers are, I think, also kindling for it. And so, is it the idols? Is it the spiritual entities along with the unbelievers? Yeah, but nonetheless, but everyone's getting it when it comes, So
Yeah, it's meant to seal the deal. So if we step
yeah,
back, sort of, I'm going to stop the share here, but if we step back a bit and just think of what the Quranic author is hoping for with this kind of conclusion, it seems the Quranic author is like, listen, I've told you all these stories about how God has the back of the prophet and the people with the prophet. We save the prophet and the people around the prophet every time. And the story of Abraham and the fire sort of demonstrates that, but really all the other stories we've spoken about as well. And it almost anticipates, this is how I think of the Quran working here, it almost anticipates a possible objection, which is, someone who's sort of wavering between the prophet's community and the opponents, is saying,
yeah,
yeah, but like, I'm looking around, you guys aren't doing that great, maybe, and like the opponents are fine. Like, look at the Christians in Byzantium, they're super strong. And it anticipates that by saying, yeah, but like, Gog and Magog are coming, and only our community will be saved. And
right, absolutely. So you could have a whole discussion on this and this sort of impulse in religious thinking, right? Nietzsche and his resentment and other world. You're powerless in this world, so you appeal to the other world as an element of slave morality that these religions sort of have. Allahu alam, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter how you look at it.
You've brought, yeah, it's
Yeah.
incredible, Hassan, brilliant from your part. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, very, very impressive.
Well, no, but anyway, all this to say, we'll have to conclude Surah 21 some other time. But
Yeah, and listen, everyone should stay attuned for these discussions of Surah 21, because in the last section there are at least three sensationally interesting things.
yeah,
There's maybe the only direct quotation from the Bible in the entire Quran. There's a description of Muhammad himself. Presumably, we can speak about it as mercy for all people or all worlds. And then, maybe I won't say it now, but the very last verse of the surah has a surprise that we'll be discussing as well.
yes. So thank you so much, Gabriel. Always great.
Pleasure's mine. Yeah, to be continued.
All right.